I'm working with a colleague right now on the differences between the people who come in to our therapy offices who are going through much more severe narcissistic relationships compared to those in the more moderate and even milder narcissistic relationships. There are big differences that influence how we work with the survivor, but it also raises confusion for people in general. The fact is, most therapists really don't learn much about psychopathy or narcissism. We don't learn it when we go to school or even after, we go to school. And these words, narcissism, psychopathy, sociopath, that kind of thing, these words are being thrown around a lot lately. But I'm not convinced that anyone is completely sure what they mean. So let's break down some key differences because it may actually help you reflect on the severity of what is happening in your relationship. And that's important to know because it can help you understand what's more unique to your experience compared to someone else's. Psychopathy is not a clinical term as much as it's more of a theoretical kind of term. The diagnostic term, the closest diagnostic term for what we call psychopathy is something called antisocial personality disorder. But they are not the same thing. They're not equivalent. And I don't want to bore you with the technical details of why that is. There are no diagnostic criteria for psychopathy per se. There are definitely lists of things that we'd see in someone psychopathic. And there are tests that capture the different criteria of psychopathy and count them up. Though in general terms, psychopathy is a pattern of interpersonal callousness, exploitation, manipulation, deviance from sort of social norms, how people kind of go through the world, what we call low autonomic arousal. Their nervous system's downregulated, so they really actually just don't even in their bodies feel bad about doing bad things. And there are other sort of characteristics like boldness, fearlessness, social dominance, and cool-headedness under pressure. And these characteristics in particular, which are often socially valued, being bold and cool under pressure, can mean that psychopathic people can really hide in plain sight or even be viewed as desirable, especially in business, in politics, or in other competitive occupations. That in turn gives these psychopathic folks more money and more power, which unfortunately makes them desirable as partners, and that never ends well. However, psychopathic people can and often do run afoul of the law. They're just, again, no adherence to social norms. Sometimes these are street hustles. Sometimes this is more corporate crime. But they never follow the rules, ever. They never follow the rules. Now, whether they actually get caught or actually break a law versus breaking a rule, and whether there are consequences and whether they're able to worm out of it, well, that's going to depend. So some of the key differences. Number one, narcissistic people, even though they may not say it out loud to you, they do feel bad after they do a bad thing. They really do. Like I said, you may not hear that they do because there's little accountability, but it makes a narcissistic person uncomfortable because narcissistic people do care deeply about how they look to other people. Now, the problem is that bad feeling that they may have about doing a bad thing, but it's often more about getting caught about doing a bad thing, right? Caught in doing a bad thing. That can turn into shame, that turns into rage, and that turns into blame shifting onto others. So it's not that you're seeing remorse or accountability, but internally they do feel bad. They feel uncomfortable. For psychopathic people, that's not a thing. People with psychopathic personalities do what they want, and other people are just simply acceptable collateral damage, and that is what it is. Number two is that narcissistic people get anxious. Sometimes they can get quite anxious, especially when it is the vulnerable presentation of narcissism. Narcissistic people do things like worry, right? But when they worry, again, that negative emotion of having to worry about something turns into lashing out at other people. because the worrying leaves them feeling uncomfortable, leaves them feeling vulnerable, and it leaves them feeling weak. Their anxiety and need for reassurance means that people who are in relationships with narcissistic people can have to spend a lot of time having to reassure them, appease them, and soothe them, and tell them everything's okay, even when you're not sure everything's going to be okay. Now, psychopathic people actually have diminished fear responses. Again, that autonomic nervous system downregulation. They're not as that kind of hyper-aroused state. They can appear fearless. They don't get anxious. And when you don't get anxious, doing a bad thing, it doesn't bother you. Not a problem. Number 3, again, to build on what I just said, narcissistic people do care a lot about what other people think of them. Well, you may think, well, my narcissistic spouse clearly didn't care what I thought of them. Well, narcissistic people will often use the people in their life who are sort of their locked in sure things and use them to regulate. This is where we might see how they will mistreat spouses, partners, kids, and employees compared to others. The narcissist will take everything out on them, but will in turn show up as gregarious and generous and fun and clever to everyone else. Narcissistic people will bristle at the idea that people don't like them, and it may turn into rage if someone doesn't. And it's like, ugh, who cares if he doesn't like me? He's a loser. To defend themselves against insecurity, or they will try harder, especially if that person who they want to like them has power. And this is why narcissistic people can often present so well in public and horribly in private. Psychopathic people, on the other side, don't give a rat's ass about what other people think of them. There is a sort of disposability and objectification of other people by psychopathic folks. So they actually just don't care. There's, again, disposable. The number 4 point is narcissistic people, in almost all cases, are insecure. They have a cauldron of unprocessed insecurity and shame always bubbling within them. And they are prone to things like social comparison, getting angry when other people are doing better than them, getting angry when things don't go their way. But they are deeply insecure. And that can drive all these narcissistic defenses, things like grandiosity and entitlement, and having to pronounce like, look how great I am, look how smart I am, look how many people think I'm great, look how much smarter than I am than everyone else. And it all becomes a cover-up for their unprocessed inner experience of lacking something. But they're not in touch with it. So if you were to attempt to say to a narcissistic person, it's okay, we all feel insecure sometimes. They will rage at you for suggesting such a thing. Psychopathic people don't have that same kind of insecurity and don't maintain the same sorts of inner neurotic conflicts. There may be shows of dominance by a psychopathic person, but those aren't as driven by insecurity, that sense of being dominant to offset feeling weak. That's not what's happening. But rather, psychopathic people will exert that dominance to establish their position on a hierarchy, being dominant simply to be dominant. Number 5, narcissistic people do care about consequences. They can be fearful of them. Now, a lot of narcissistic people often don't face them because the world is enabling and narcissistic people can charm their way out of stuff and the world doesn't understand narcissism. But narcissistic people are aware that there could be consequences and they care deeply about potentially being called out, looking publicly foolish, getting into trouble, going to prison, facing penalties, bad optics, their kids hating them. They do care. And it may not seem like they do because of all their bluster and bravado, but they do. And while narcissistic people may bend and break rules because they're entitled, and if they get away with doing it a lot, they will keep doing it. It's like a kid who keeps pushing back on their bedtime. If all their little stunts work, the kid's going to keep doing it. But if the consequences that a narcissistic person faces for bad behavior are clear and swift, or the consequences are bad, are public, or shaming enough, it can be a deterrent for narcissistic folks. Psychopathic people, in contrast, their behavior is not shaped nearly, almost at all, by consequences. In fact, there's research suggesting a lack of capacity for psychopathic people at their taking the long view, focusing instead on the short-term gain of a behavior exclusively. And the consequences just don't register. And again, all of this relates to the out of touch with social norms part of psychopathy. So the consequences don't register. And as a result, they don't act as a deterrent. A psychopathic person is much more likely to repeat a crime even after they've served a prison sentence or commit a new one, like I said, when they're out on conditional release or after serving a prison sentence. Even when they face the consequences, it still may not be enough to deter future bad behavior. So there's a coldness and a callousness and an absence of neuroticism in psychopathy. But that neuroticism, it's actually much more at play in narcissism than you'd think. Relationships with narcissistic people are often held together and maintained through things like trauma bonding. Relationships with psychopathic folks are held together by fear. Your fear of them. They're not afraid of you. There are, of course, lots of commonalities. There's a lot of statistical overlap between psychopathy and narcissism. The low empathy, the grandiosity, the entitlement, the arrogance, the selfishness, the vindictiveness, the lack of accountability, the posturing, the manipulation, the betrayal, the control. They're all quite similar between narcissism and psychopathy. The sadism and the suspiciousness in psychopathy is more pronounced. But when a narcissistic person is hell-bent on revenge, it can feel like the willful cruelty that we observe in sadism is just not as endemic a pattern in narcissism. And then there is that liminal space between malignant narcissism and psychopathy. It's not that cold, calculated, bold, fearless, dominant, without any anxiety. There is still some of the insecurity, some of the compensating behavior. I'm going to have the biggest house. I'm going to have the most tricked out truck. I'm going to have the coolest stuff, and I'll do anything to get it, to be better than others. Again, in narcissism, we're seeing that more as insecurity, comes from that source of insecurity. Psychopathy, it's more of the dominance for dominance's sake. Remember that psychopathy is actually quite uncommon. Calculations show around 1% of the population. It might be higher in prison populations, but of the general population, about 1%. Whereas rates of noticeable narcissism that cause problems with relationships probably sit closer to at least 10%. That's a big difference. But that space between the two, sort of that malignant narcissism spot, is where we see patterns like coercive control, isolation, severe emotional abuse, stuff that feels very psychopathy adjacent, but since psychopathy is quite rare, is more likely to be what we'd put in the bucket of malignant narcissism. And for all of these reasons, theories like the dark triad and the dark tetrad capture these severe overlaps. And that's why I so prefer to use this word antagonism, which is the big bucket that captures all of these patterns at differing levels of severity. So then we can talk about not just severity, but also the presence of neurotic stuff, which can mean, again, that stuff like the anxiousness and stuff shows up differently. Now, what the hell does all of this mean for your relationships? Well, a lot. Relationships with a psychopathic folks are pretty much one big terrifying betrayal. It may take a minute to see it, but it's here when you're dealing with someone psychopathic. This is someone where one day you may find out that they were using an alias, they have another family, they're already married to someone else, is grifting you for money, is shaking down your business, is draining elderly parents' bank accounts, and where the menacing threats are always there. The menace is more chilling and terrifying, but this is a pattern we're less likely to see. Now, some psychopathic folks are very, very polished, so it may not ever escalate to violence, but in your body, it feels like the potential for something terrible to happen is there. Not the reactive, dysregulated violence, but the sense that something bad may happen if I step out of line. And our current prevention systems that the courts and law enforcement offer, restraining orders and other things that law enforcement and DV programs, domestic violence programs can do, often don't work here. In a psychopathic relationship, the financial abuse may be sinister, with money hidden all kinds of ways and in ways that it cannot be reached. Or the person has committed all sorts of illegal acts, so the money goes away, like a Ponzi scheme. Now, in narcissistic relationships, that's more of the confusion. Some normal days, some vulnerable, real moments here and there. Manipulation and gaslighting. It's like a lot happening at once. And all the bad stuff, yeah, it's happening, but it's not happening all the time. And if you're really in that moderate to mild side of things, it may not feel menacing or scary, but rather hurtful, frustrating, betraying, confusing, and annoying, but you may not be living with this sense of terror in your body. Because of the relative rarity of psychopathy, it's usually only specialized scholars and clinicians who work with it and study it, or people who may work in much more specialized settings like jails and prisons. Any of my work in it, came as a result of my career in research. And it is rarely what any of us are going to see in an outpatient private practice. For example, we're not even going to see as many people in relationships with psychopathic folks because the condition is more rare. Narcissistic people do go to therapy. That's not unusual. Though the narcissistic people often don't think they're the problem, but they will go to therapy. But unless it's court-ordered or mandated, it's much, much more rare for a psychopathic person to ever go to therapy. And when they do show up in therapy, they can be more tactical, and the therapy may not be something that they're enlisting in the service of meaningful behavior change. Now, are there cases here and there when it comes to psychopathy where some small improvements happen? Yeah, but we can't generalize from an anomaly or a unicorn. In general, that's not what the treatment literature with psychopathy suggests. Anyhow, I have heard the term psychopathy and narcissism thrown around interchangeably. They're not interchangeable. Narcissism actually in many ways is much more complicated because of the insecurity, the neurotic stuff, the vacillation, and the vulnerability and the spectrum of it. Still a heartbreaking and painful relationship, but it's very, very different than the experience of someone who has been through a relationship with someone who is psychopathic or has a psychopathic personality, which is often one where there is coercion, there is terror, and there are such wide-ranging betrayals that a person who's been in such a relationship will say their entire life is upended and healing can take a long time. I hope that gives some clarification. And again, it's a very, very robust, area of inquiry and exploration. But again, it's much more rare on the psychopathy side. But when it does happen, it can have very, very lasting effects for a person who's been through such a relationship. Thanks again.